I'm Tom Varner, and welcome to Adventures in TV Land. For today's adventure, I've come to Claremore, Oklahoma, to visit the Will Rogers Memorial Museum. Now, Will Rogers is one of Oklahoma's favorite sons. He is also a native. He grew up near Claremore, and it was his hometown. And there is a museum here dedicated in his honor. This is, I believe, property here where the museum memorial is located. It was actually property Will Rogers himself had owned, and it was his home away from home. Will Rogers was a famous comedian, humorist, I guess, not really comedian, a humorist around the early 1900s. He had a famous Broadway show in New York where he did rope tricks and told stories and jokes, and it was very popular, the Will Rogers Follies. So, and he's from here, from Claremore, so we're going to go in and check it out. Now here outside the Will Rogers Museum, there's this Will Rogers relief in stone. Above in that window is a smiling Will Rogers. This is kind of a big room here with several paintings of Will Rogers, as well as some of his saddles and a few other artifacts. Rogers was a horseman and could perform a variety of tricks, and so he did have a lot of saddles. He grew up on a farm, and that's how he began his career in entertainment. Here we have a smaller statue. There's a larger statue of this somewhere, but of Will Rogers typing away at his typewriter. Here's a painting of Rogers. Actually, all the paintings here in this room, they were done by Charles Banks Wilson. And the quote says, "Will Rogers saw no difference between the king and the common working man. The things of life are the same to both." Alright, in this room, there are several artifacts and photos from when Will Rogers was growing up. There's photos of his family, and various items from their household. It talks about, displays kind of how his parents met and both sides of his family. Here is kind of one of the centerpieces of the museum. It's a Will Rogers statue. I never met a man I didn't like. Alright, this room here, there are some photographs, some quotes. In the background there is a snippet of Rogers talking on the radio. You can listen to several of Will Rogers' radio broadcasts here in this room. His radio show was one of the most popular radio shows of all time. There's a totem pole carving of Will Rogers. And this totem pole was carved and preserved with donations from the crews of the USS Will Rogers. Here he is. Here lies the tomb, the grave of Will Rogers. Will Rogers died before his time in an airplane crash in Alaska. And this writing says, if you live life right, death is a joke as far as fear is concerned. Will Rogers, Oklahoma's favorite son, eighth child of Clement Van and Mary America Schmisser Rogers, rests beside his revered wife and with his beloved family in a tomb under this garden and sarcophagus. Here is a plaque about Will Rogers Memorial, dedicated on November 4th, 1938, the anniversary of his birth, built by the people of the state of Oklahoma. And this memorial plaque is from the Cherokee Nation. Will Rogers was a Cherokee. Now this room here is a replica of Will Rogers' personal study in his home in California. Now his house there is part of a state park out there. I believe you can go visit it, and I think you can tour it. I'm not 100% sure about that. I've never been there. I would love to someday, but this is a replica of his personal study. And here we have another bust of Rogers, smaller version. Now this room, this is a screening room. This is a small screening room where they show certain films over throughout the day, and you can come in here and you can just watch those films over and over and over. This museum actually has a larger screening room as well, where you can watch movies in a regular movie theater. I think I should mention before I continue here, for modern audiences, they probably don't understand the impact of Will Rogers. There is not an entertainer on the planet who was as big as Will Rogers was during his life. He was world famous on radio, in the newspapers, and film. His newspaper column was published in more newspapers in the world, and his radio program was carried by more radio stations in the world than any other entertainer ever. Here is one of his straw hats, same hat that is in that painting. And here, this room here, there's various displays from certain points in Will Rogers' life, as well as that large painting there. Here is Wild West Roper, the Vaudevillian, the Ziegfeld Follies. That's right, Will Rogers was a Broadway star. And this painting here, it's just really cool. It's an awesome centerpiece. It shows Rogers riding various horses and doing various rope tricks that he was known for, as well as kind of in the background there at the top, important parts in his life. There's a castle from the Connecticut Yankee, King Arthur's court. Here's Will Rogers, the movie star, this display. Will Rogers, the writer. And this display is about Charles M. Russell, who was a sculptor who sculpted many of the famous sculptures of Rogers. Now here we have some photos and I believe a model, a couple models actually, and a few artifacts from the USS Will Rogers, as well as I'm not for sure the submarine code, but the submarine of Will Rogers. This map shows all the different places in the world that Rogers traveled. He traveled not only for movies, but he did a lot of relief efforts worldwide. He flew his own plane there. This section of the museum is the life of Will Rogers told through miniatures. This first scene is entitled Boyhood Ranch. You can see the farm Will Rogers grew up on. That farm still exists today and you can visit it. This next scene is called School Days for Rope and Willie. It shows Rogers lassoing the ankle of a girl he's attracted to. This scene is called Claremore, 1895. And you can see Rogers there riding down the middle of the street on his horse. Here we have branding calves in Texas. So it shows Rogers catching a calf, preparing it to be branded. Now this one here is called Cattle Drive to Kansas. And in the background, some of the cattle and everything, they're asleep. And Will Rogers is on his horse, looking up into the night sky. This one is called Steer Roping. Here we have Ziegfeld Follies. Rogers center stage. He would come on stage, do a few rope tricks, and just talk to the audience. This box is called First Radio Broadcast, and you can see photos here in the museum of this very same set, this very same historic moment. This set is simply called Family Man. This is called Newspaper Columnist. You can see a recreation of this study here in the museum. Now this is called A Connecticut Yankee. It was a film that Rogers was a part of, starred in. And there you see him by the car, typing away, getting his column ready to be distributed. This piece is Relief Trip to Nicaragua. Rogers took his airplane down there and did a lot of relief work after the earthquake there. And this little box is called Final Scene, and it shows the native up north in Alaska calling out to the crashed airplane where Will Rogers died. Here's the Will Rogers Theater. I had mentioned this earlier. You can come into the theater and they actually have a ticket window where you can pick the movie you would like to see, and you can pick a seat and sit down there and you can watch the movie here in the movie theater. Now I believe they also rent this space out for other occasions, but it's pretty awesome. I love movie theaters. Here's the ticket booth right here with a selection of movies there. Now these displays here tell Will Rogers' life story from the time he was born and grew up until the time his airplane tragically crashed in Alaska. If you knew nothing about Will Rogers, you could learn a very good synopsis of his life from what is found here in this hallway. Now this exhibit is called The Final Journey. It's about Will Rogers' journey to Alaska. Here are some artifacts, some of Rogers' clothing. And here's the timeline of his time there in his final days. Rogers' co-pilot was Wiley Post. It was someone he was close friends with and he had flown all around the world with, in all honesty. He died as well. There is a model of the plane that they were flying in. As you can see, it's got a seaplane. And here is the pontoon cap
for the plane, the actual pontoon cap. It's quite remarkable. Piece of history there. And here, this is Roger's typewriter. He had it aboard with him on the plane because he was writing his newspaper column right up to the day he died. Now in the basement of the museum, the memorial, there is a children's area. Got all kinds of activities here for kids to do. There's a school section. There's a section where they can kind of build things with Lincoln logs. All kinds of, I think there's a little art section. There is a theater. They can actually dress up in costumes and perform and do a thing on stage. I think there's even a little radio setup. This display talks about the founding of the Will Rogers Memorial. This place was all built in 1938, so just 3 years after Rogers passed away. And I just really like this painting. It is a painting of an elder Rogers just looking out over the ocean, I would say in California, just gazing out to the future.
Well, this has been another adventure in TV land where we visited the Will Rogers Memorial Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma. If you've liked this video, hit the like button. If you disliked, hit the dislike button. Subscribe to my channel for further content and ring that bell for email notifications. And if there's some place that you would like to see me visit, or you have a suggestion about some future video you would like to see me do, leave a comment in the comment section. If you enjoyed this adventure, or any of the adventures in TV land, you can help support this channel by going to Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon and making donations or becoming a member at either one of those two places. Thanks for watching. Until next time, that's a wrap.